different audiences call for a different mask or a different version of ourselves. And so sometimes those dissociative tactics encourage us to mask up, encourage us to drift off, encourage us not to be there.
It's helpful and it's beneficial because if you're in a terrible scenario where you're being abused, it actually makes perfect sense to zone out of it and not mentally be there because your brain is trying to keep you safe. Hey everybody, it's Bianca.
Welcome back, Evolvers. It's Emilia. Thank you for joining us in another episode. And this one is going to hopefully get into the nitty-gritties that are meaningful for you in the ways that, every single day we're all out here trying to do our best, trying to do the things that are the most impactful in our worlds, whether that be being great at your job, being, the best fur baby, or I'm sorry, not the best fur baby, but maybe that too. Who knows? Being the best fur baby.
We listen and we
mama,
don't judge.
We don't judge. Being the best plant mama, daddy, whatever. Anywho, with that being said, this topic is going to be all things, specifically how to tell if you're dissociating. And quick disclaimer, something really cool that I learned today. Thank you, Bianca. I have always used the term disassociating. Fun fact, disassociation is really the umbrella term. So if you hear that kind of crop up in this episode, they very much are used interchangeably, whereas dissociating is far more focused in on that psychological phenomenon that we're going to be getting into in this episode. So how to tell if you're dissociating. So I have a client that comes to mind when we talk about this episode because he had come to me initially for relationship challenges, and we just did a relationship really actually beautifully in-depth dialogue around how to repair a relationship rupture. So if you're interested in that type of dialogue, subscribe now and make sure you listen to that episode after this one. But he had come to me and it was his first relationship. And so he was learning the ins and outs of what love looks like, what love doesn't look like, and what is certainly most not love. And for lack of better words, one thing led to another. And we essentially got digging into areas that were impacting his life. One of them being daydreaming. So he shared with me that more often than not, when he is going about his day-to-day life and he's working and he's doing all these things, he catches himself daydreaming and just drifting off into this fairy tale world. And
La La Land.
when La La Land. Yes. And so when I asked him, how is this impacting him? Ultimately, what we got uncovered through the many dialogues that we were able to have was that this dissociating tactic that his system has used usually comes in as a pattern to not really experience or acknowledge some of the really uncomfortable feelings and emotions and series of events that has happened as a result of his relationship. And so something, for example, that relationship had not been aligned, that relationship ended up ending. And as a result of many different points of rupture that never got repaired. And so the difficult emotions that his unconscious was trying to process through, the best way that his system learned how to do that as a result of his upbringing, where emotions were not talked about, your innermost true feelings and what you're going through from a mental health standpoint is not talked about. You would be, who knows, labeled what if you did. The way in which he was able to cope with what it was that he was going through was to disconnect, for lack of better words, from reality and go into this dissociative state, which was him in a dream world being the hero of some imaginary story. And so that impacted him because when it came to his work, we talked about it, where he would have to do like the work that he was trying to do a couple times. So he wasn't making as much progress as he would have liked. So this is one example of many examples that occur in real life. And there's so many other clients that are coming to mind, so many people that are coming to mind because, just that like when life feels super overwhelming or things just feel like, you can't parse through them, you're experiencing troubles in what feels like every area of your life, it's a lot easier to kind of just disconnect and run afloat. And that is one of the most common masks of dissociating, and your central nervous system telling you, hey, there's something going on underneath the surface that we are uncomfortable with. And so ultimately, the question that I think is worth discussing in here is, how do we first tell when we are starting to point towards, not when we're in, but point towards that state and or that mechanism that our system naturally deploys to help shield us from any pain and suffering and uncomfortable emotions. But more importantly, what are the patterns within our life that might have us pointing to that more often as a tactic to cope with and manage our life?
One thing that I do want to make sure that I say too before we dive into that is dissociating is a spectrum. It's not what many people think it is, where you're basically just completely blank and you're an empty shell and you eventually come back into your body. That is the most extreme version of dissociation. Other versions of dissociation is numbing and tuning things out. It's scrolling through your phone, doom scrolling, not even realizing that you've just spent 4 hours on TikTok because you're trying to run away from whatever the feelings are that you're having. Or I've been here, so like not super proud of it, but like when you just ate an entire pack of Oreos or you just downed an entire bag of chips because you're literally eating without even thinking. That is all forms of dissociation. Your conscious mind literally just shut off or it dimmed down. And you are not present in your conscious mind, and you're basically acting on impulse, or you're acting on autopilot, or you're just engaging in behaviors and activities without consciously thinking about it. So it is a wide spectrum. I have clients that say, I literally wake up, I get through my day, and it's the end of the day and I have no idea what happened.
Yeah.
That's dissociating too, because you're not present. So for anyone who's like, this episode isn't for me, I've never dissociated, you probably have. You probably just didn't realize that that's what that was. And again, I don't know if you said this, but I guess I'll start here. What's the cause of it? It's an attempt to outrun negative emotions. It's an attempt to numb out or avoid or eliminate negative emotions, because there's something within you that doesn't believe that you're capable of handling it. When you're experiencing severe harm, like a lot of the clients Emilia and I get, let's say there's a trauma survivor, dissociating, we did like the episode that we did on procrastinating, it's actually adaptive, because if
it really is.
It's helpful and it's beneficial, because if you're in a terrible scenario where you're being abused, it actually makes perfect sense to zone out of it and not mentally be there, because your brain is trying to keep you safe, So in extreme cases, it is an adaptive coping mechanism. It stops becoming adaptive when you're no longer in that circumstance, though. When you're stressing out about a paper you have to write, and so you're zoning out and you're stress eating and you're dissociating because you don't want to write this paper, that's not adaptive.
Yeah. It's a seemingly small starting point that has meaningfully big impacts.
Yeah.
And I actually wrote an article on this recently, actually, so I'm going to have that linked in the show notes too. Ultimately, it's the different phases of disassociation, because like you said, it's a spectrum, and that spectrum exists out of I've referred to our system, specifically our central nervous system, and the psychological systems that we have at play. One of them that we've talked about so often within the realm of this podcast is from an IFS informed standpoint, which is internal family systems. So if you can imagine, there's parts of us that try to protect ourselves from harm, or more importantly, perceived threat or harm. That perception can be pretty much clouded by our past set of experience. And most likely the past set of experiences that we have, our brain is remembering those painful experiences, and more often those painful emotions. And so when those come up, that could be overwhelm. That's one thing that I see a lot when it comes to dissociation is when we're experiencing overwhelm, usually a go-to mechanism that our system, our parts are going into and say, okay, engage, just like, an inside out, you kind of picture the control board and each emotion has a certain function. Picture each part within us having a specific function to keep us safe or to keep us out of harm's way. And sometimes it's those firefighters that are really quick at going to dissociative tactics in efforts to distract us from and gain proximity to the overwhelm emotion. It might also be a protector that is in a manager role where they're trying to proactively manage your life. And if you know that a breakup is coming, it might constantly deploy that dissociative mechanism that just has you spacing out when it comes to your work. And then before you know it, by the time that day is closed, not only have you not made progress on that project at work, but you also haven't maybe called up a couple of friends and a couple of relationships you haven't really tended to, or maybe you forgot. And this is one of the faces actually that I experienced a lot when it came to the dissociative tactic that my system deployed, which was what's called and known as the dissociative amnesia, which in this article I had written is the person that forgets or the person that's really busy. And so those two were my states where I was super busy and kept myself super busy, because slowing down, I would have to really understand what is happening in my world, what is happening in my life. And then the dissociative amnesia was the forgetfulness. And I have a picture of Dory and Finding Nemo, where it's a lot easier to conveniently forget things when ultimately, if you were to actually remember things, the things that are going on in your life, in your worlds, whatever, it's overwhelm, it's painful, you feel some degree of suffering, it's easier to forget that. So you have a part within your brain that's just deleting files so that you don't have to navigate those painful, harmful emotions. And so yes, it exists on a spectrum. Yes, there are many different faces. And that's why that term masking up is so, it's so understandable to so many of us just naturally as human beings, because we understand that, different audiences call for, or at least this is the perceived narrative, different audiences call for a different mask or a different version of ourselves. And so sometimes those dissociative tactics encourage us to mask up, encourage us to drift off, encourage us not to be there. I mean, I just have a memory that's coming to mind right now that whenever I remember we were sitting around the dinner table as a family and my dad would start to talk about work, I would, parts of me would just totally drift off, totally dissociate. And the reason underneath that I can now know was because I felt so uncared for, because we didn't talk about anything else aside from that. We didn't talk about what was actually learned at school, or we didn't talk about what we were emotionally experiencing in life, or what was happening within the friend dynamics. And granted, that's a two-way street because I, had stuff underneath that, but it was just work and work and work and work. And they definitely tried in their own regard, but there was parts of me that just got so fed up and overwhelmed of like, I feel like what happens in my world is not anything of importance in comparison to what happened in my dad's world, because he's the breadwinner in our family and he goes to work and has all these things happen, and this is his only chance to pretty much vent. But yeah, so like it's those little things where we can drift off, we can forget, we can become over busy and overbook ourselves as a result of just trying to run away from those emotions. And if we can understand the patterns and what creates that, then we can craft a meaningful way to change that, right?
So how do you tell? How do you guide your clients to be able to tell whether or not they're headed in that direction?
Yeah. One of the biggest words that I educate my clients on in this arena is when they're talking about the problems that's existing in their worlds, right? So like, for example, that client, I'm not able to finish my projects in my work as much. They might see it as procrastination or whatever, but the symptom is that I'm not finishing my projects. And I help to educate them that ultimately that's the symptom of a root issue. The root issue is you not attuning to your emotional state and when it shifts and when it's changing. And so the root issue and what I really help clients do is demonstrate attunement to one's own emotional state. So for example, I'll usually model it and I'll do so by imagery. I think that's really helpful. So for example, I'll say, when I think about Tucker, my little 10-pound chihuahua who's right now at the time of recording, he's a little sick and he's sitting over there to my right. When I think about Tucker, right, what are the emotions that I feel? And immediately I'll say, I feel like I'm flooded with that love. I feel so much love, and I feel it in my heart center. I feel it in my shoulders. I feel it in like my whole upper torso. And when I think about how cute he is and the last adventure that we went on, I try to expand where else does that emotion exist within my body. So what I'm doing in real time is, number one, naming the emotion, which is attunement in itself. What is the bodily somatic experience that's happening, but also how am I perceiving that emotion? Is Tucker someone that I love and I care about? And I'll talk about that from it's called triangulated standpoint, because we're not just talking about me and ultimately my emotions. We're talking about how my emotions are evoked as a result of when I think about Tucker, my little dog. And then once we have that as a baseline, we are learning to attune to the client's emotion. And I'll ask them, like, who's someone that's important in your life, or who's a dog or a pet or whatever. Once we have that baseline of, I can understand that when I shift gears of thinking about Tucker into, let's say, a cold shower and that emotional experience, are you going to dread the cold shower? Do you feel that dread? Do you feel it in your body? Where do you feel that in your body? What does that look like? What does that feel like, right? We have a shifting of, okay, I'm going to be going on a walk tonight and it's going to be 11 degrees and it's going to be really, really, really cold. What will that feel like? We draw a contrast for them. And so attunement is the number one thing that helps them understand and attune to their own emotional landscape, what is called the internal landscape. And that root cause is impacting the system. So what I do with clients is make sure that we go to that root. We understand that root. We understand why it's there. And if there's some trauma that's affecting that, we usually take care of that. But for a very, very basic, for anyone that's listening to this episode, it's understanding and localizing what is the biggest emotion. And thought records can really be helpful for this as well. What is the biggest emotion that you tend to feel the most? And what's that pattern? And usually it's overwhelm. And it starts as overwhelm, but there's a deeper emotion underneath that. Usually there's fear. And so we look at, what is that fear saying? How are you internalizing that? How are you interpreting that? And then we work on the thought patterns that are around that usually point us to the dissociative pattern. I also am really curious about how you navigate that as well.
One of the biggest tools that I'll use with clients is grounding techniques. So you kind of just walked us through one version of that, which is more of like a visualization technique. What I'll teach clients to do if they're finding themselves dissociating throughout the day is set timers to go off, or reminders to go off, where every couple of hours this timer or this alarm goes off. And then what you do is you check in and you get grounded in your body. So you take a couple of deep breaths, and then you do the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method, which is 5 things I can see, 4 things I can hear, 3 things I can touch, 2 things I can smell, and something I can taste, or something like that. Or the point and say. So like you point to something in the room and then you say what it is. Little techniques like this to help you kind of teach your body to come back into the room that you're currently in. Obviously, what the tool that I did is a tool that kind of what's the word? Not preamble. Prelude?
Preemptively?
It comes before prequel. It's kind of a prequel.
Prequels.
It's a prequel
Proceeds.
to what it precedes. Thank
Oh.
you. It
Yeah.
precedes. No, that works. It precedes what Emilia said. So you do these grounding techniques to eventually get to the point where you can say, okay, what is it that I'm actually feeling?
Mm-hmm.
Why am I feeling this overwhelm? Why am I feeling this fear? What is the story that I'm telling myself about the situation that I'm currently in? And then once you can do that and do both of those in combination over time, the dissociation will stop happening as much, because once you know what the problem is, you can then develop the skills and the tools to address it. So what you said is fire, and what I suggested is something that you can do before doing that if you don't feel as though you're in a place where you even know what it is that you're feeling, because unfortunately a lot of us don't. We can't name it, we just know we don't feel good.
Right. That's so true. I'm glad you said that. And I do the work that I do with clients is usually, a lot of it is what you just mentioned, but for the clients that I've spoken to around this topic, usually they can name the emotion and they do know in a general sense where that shows up in their body because of the way in which I ask those questions. So I appreciate you really saying that, because the grounding techniques are, it's like that foundational work before what I said, and both of them are really powerful and really significant. And that's where the one-on-one work is so helpful, because obviously it's customized. This topic that you're listening to right now, Bianca and I will be able to customize that, and the techniques that are right and suited for you, that are meaningful and have a big impact for you, we customize that based on your unique set of experiences. So in closing, my episode suggestion is 296, how to be more in control of your feelings. Feelings have an impact, and if we don't acknowledge them, then they can kind of take away our presence in the current state. And that's all what we talked about here. B?
366, what to do when you feel like giving up. It can be really scary when you're dissociating. It can be really scary when you're dealing with a lot of these significant mental health challenges, whether it's on the lower end of the spectrum or the highest end. And you can get to a point where you're like, I'm so sick of this. I just want to be done. I don't want to deal with this anymore. That's a really good episode to kind of guide you through what to do if you're at that space. And like Emilia said, if you're getting closer and closer to that space, please reach out. We're both taking clients, whether it's one-on-one or through the You Do You program. There's so many resources here at Evolve that you can utilize at whatever the stage is that you're ready for to dip your toe in. So please, you don't have to go through this alone. Reach out. That is literally what we're here for. And we will talk to you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.